DAX, D-A-X. These guys were a bunch of yuppies in the early 80s that were buying out lots and buildings in East Harlem. That's when the market was shooting up. They were buying like crazy in East Harlem, right? And then the fucking market crashed, they lost everything. They still have that corner of property, so they're looking to sell it. That's enough time for gentrification. Not 5 years, but over 20 years already. Over 20 years. So they assume they're getting very close to it. And the only way it's going to really turn over is when we start losing the brownstones. Projects is the last thing. It's the brownstone right now.
Me and my wife, Vanessa, we moved to the neighborhood a year and a half ago, and I love everything about this neighborhood. It's so much better than the last one. But compared to the last one, we had a super in our building, and our building was a 18th century, 1800s tenement building. And if that could have a super, there's no reason why a large building like this one shouldn't. And with the amount of rent, especially that I'm paying, I know that everyone has their own amounts that they're paying. I believe that we need a super. We deserve a super.
I'm in court with her. She's trying to get me out of here because it's rent control. Look at my kitchen. I have to live with everything out of the cabinets because of the mildew. And I have to live like a pig because I can't use my cabinets. Everything is out. So she took me to court because I have too much stuff in my apartment. She gave me this new, but see, it's all full of mildew. My asthma is so bad, okay, that I can't even breathe sometimes. And I have all these appointments trying to keep a roof over my head. I mean, your husband doesn't die every year. I was with my husband 28 years, you know? Now, all of a sudden, I'm trying to put my life back together, and this woman's trying to kick me out. Where am I going to go? I'm trying to keep the little that I have.
Landlord has to realize that in the early 80s and late 80s, this tenants association kept this building free of drugs. Right. We would have a tenant patrol. Yes. I live on the top floor near the roof, and I will come home from work, and there will be multitudes of people by the roof landing smoking crack, getting high. And it was us that kept the building safe for us and clean for the landlord.
Legally, we're entitled to live here, whether it be rent control, rent stabilization, because we've been here many years. We all pay our rent on time. They can't say anything about that. So if you expect service in return, it's not asking too much.
This is my husband, Joe Cuba. He's the father of Boogaloo. He has 3 gold records. He's played all over the world. He was the first Latino to make English words to Spanish music so that the Americans could understand it. Right. Okay? Yeah. He was the first true crossover. Missed the hell out of him.
They called me one time at my job and offered me $2,000 to move out. Because $2,000. And it was the landlord himself called me and said, yes, he called and he said, you've been living here long enough, isn't it time to move? Wow. So he said, I said, then what are you offering? He said, $2,000. I said, you forgot quite a few zeros on that.
I'm so glad my husband's not here to see this. Okay? I'm so glad he's not here. But he would be proud that at least I'm standing, keeping to my guns. I didn't run.
As long as we stay together.
I'm not running nowhere. This is all I have. This is my memories. 28 years living in here with him. Nah. I'm going to fight whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, I'm going to do.
There's a certain economic reality to where we are in terms of being located on the island of Manhattan, one of the most expensive, islands, in the country.
East Harlem just happened to be right next to Yorkville. Probably the wealthiest neighborhood in the entire city of New York, if not the state of New York. And so people want to get close to Yorkville. We are it. Elbarrio is it. You can't get any closer.
Because of the developments coming up, those owners of those tenement buildings will eventually start putting pressure on the tenants and eventually find ways of forcing them out. It's a cancer, and you can't stop the cancer once it begins to spread.
Good afternoon. As most of you know, I'm Nat Wood, and you're watching 30 Frames a Second. That was some clips from a young filmmaker, a dynamic filmmaker. His name is Andrew Padilla. And it's about, as you know, we're shooting on 104th Street between Lex and 3rd, what we used to refer to as Spanish Harlem, Elbarrio. Now it's East Harlem. I guess when they get through gentrifying it, it'll be the east of Upper Manhattan, or
upper East Side, or Upper Yorkville, or Spaha, something of that nature.
Spaha, I like that one. They're going to steal that one. If they don't have it,
oh, they already have. Yeah,
Spaha. Okay, we're sitting in Spaha, formerly Elbarrio. And it is my pleasure, my honor, to present to you a dynamic young filmmaker whose film is just like hot as firecrackers. It's standing room only. We're going to have it at the People's Film Festival coming at the end of May. As I said before, he's Andrew Padilla, and we're going to talk to him for the next 55 minutes or so. So if you guys have my opening, we're going to roll that opening, and we'll be back with the producer-director of Elbarrio Tours, Andrew Padilla. That into the fact where the victim is now the perpetrator and the perpetrator is now the victim. And that just drives me crazy. All right. As I said, we have the producer-director from the film, the red-hot film, Elbarrio Tours, Andrew Padilla. When I first saw the film, it was like going home, being in the 50s and 60s. I was surprised at how young this gentleman was. I was expecting someone a little closer to my own age. But he's from this community, and he was raised up by old school parents, so that explains a lot. With that, I want to introduce to you Andrew Padilla, the incredible filmmaker. As a filmmaker, I don't impress easily, brother, and you really caught my attention. That was extraordinary.
Well, that means a lot. Thank you. It means a lot to be here, and it means a lot to be a part of the People's Film Festival, so I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
What made you choose this particular subject about this particular community?
Well, I mean, this is the community I'm born and raised in, so it was something that I'd kind of begun to notice. I'd noticed that there were neighbors and there were loved ones, family and friends who were moving away, and I noticed that people began to move in, whether it be in the form of realty, whether it be in the form of new storefronts, whether it be new residents, that traditionally would never have imagined being above 96th Street, which was kind of like an unspoken border in New York. And so I kind of wanted to know why, because even though East Harlem has been through a lot, and there are a lot of connotations people have about the neighborhood, throughout all the struggles that it's had, there's always been a tremendous sense of community, that even when the neighborhood was going through its worst times, you still had people out there looking out for you, be it someone who's looking out the window, be it a small business owner still holding on.
Yeah, that you're old school, looking out the window, yeah.
No, and that's how it is. And so I started to wonder, why were those things going, and now why were businesses and residents moving in that would never have otherwise considered it? And I was curious. That's kind of what began it for me. It was less so much that, and I think sometimes people confuse gentrification when they talk about it. I think that a lot of people feel as though it's this wanting to cling to the past. And I think as I researched more, I mean, yes, you know, there's a culture here that should be prized. There's a history here that should be told. But there's also a people here that should remain.
Right.
And it's the people aspect of it that really, really got me. You know, these are lives that are getting pushed, and they don't have a ton of control over it. They think they have less control over it than they do. And so, you know, Nelson in the clip, he says, this is a cancer, and once it starts, you can't stop it. And I didn't feel that way, and so that's why I wanted to do the film. And
yeah, Nelson made reference to real estate flipping. Now, there was a well, I don't even know if I should call it a scandal, but a financial attack upon communities of color.
Sure.
That we refer to as subprime. And when they brought various banks to court over this issue. And in bringing various banks to court over this issue, what was going on in the real estate market, what ultimately just collapsed the real estate market for poor people, not for rich people. Rich people tended to make billions of dollars off of this.
Well, actually, Bloomberg's net worth in 2002 was $5 billion.
Right.
His net worth is $27 billion right now.
That's amazing.
I don't know many people who have made, you know, who have quintupled their money in the past 12 years.
In a blind trust, so I don't know how blind that trust is, but
it's the most talented blind
I'm telling
thing in the
you,
world.
I trust that blind man. But one of the things, they brought Wells Fargo to court because Wells Fargo took over Golden West, and it took over a number of companies who were heavily into subprime. And they subpoenaed a lot of the emails that came out of Wells Fargo. And subprime loans were referred to in the emails as ghetto loans. It was reverse redlining, whereas people of color, irrespective of their net worth and their financial stability, were steered toward these subprime loans. And these subprime loans in the emails were referred to as ghetto loans for mud people.
I'd heard the ghetto loans.
Right. For mud people.
I hadn't heard mud people.
Right.
That's
right.
Incendiary language at best. That's
right.
Pretty bad.
Which leads one to conclude that it is not just a question of economics, that there is a certain aspect of the corporate agenda that takes into considerations the vulnerability of certain ethnic groups.
I think you're saying race is a factor.
Yeah.
You're saying,
I'm trying to get around it.
I'm saying race is a factor. That's
nice,
no,
okay.
Race is a factor, and race is definitely a factor.
Right.
I think that one of the things I like to say is, you know, the color is now green.
Right.
Because if you are moving out of these neighborhoods, they don't ask you what your color is. They ask, you know, can you pay $2,200? Can you pay $2,400?
Right.
And if you can't, you leave. It just so happens that the majority of the people being pushed out are people of color in communities like this. So that's what makes it tricky, because redlining was something that was so very racial that now, as you know, you have the reverse of white flight, and you have all this money now coming into the city, and a lot of this development going unchecked. A lot of the same victims are the ones who were victims of redlining and ghetto packing back in the 50s and the 60s. I mean, the fact that you would have, I mean, that's the thing, New York had, not that it didn't have racial problems, but there were integrated or semi-integrated neighborhoods in the city. Granted, you might have had, you know, if you cross this block, you get beat up by Germans, cross this block, you get beat up by Italians, as Judge Edwin Torres spoke about in his interview. But you did have a whole bunch of different cultures living in these neighborhoods, and one of the things that really began to ghettoize New York was what you said, redlining. You know, you'll have any investment that in a neighborhood with over 5% people of color is deemed risky.
Right.
You know, I mean, that kind of incentivizes people to get out. You know, yeah, people getting out of a racial reason.
Right.
But then also from a small business reason, if you can't expand your small business, why would you stay? You know,
Right.
if you can't make capital improvements to your apartment, why do you stay?
Right.
And so I think that, you know, now the same victims are the ones who were left, the ones who tried to make do and were able to make communities out of what the city had left them. Now you see them getting pushed out because now all of a sudden what they have is valuable. So race is an element. It's not the primary element, but
Right.
it's certainly there. And I think that's what just makes this so difficult to deal with.
Right. Right.
You know?
There's a couple of things that you alluded to. First of all, there is what people tell me, and then there is what I see. And
Okay.
you
All right.
know, I'm living in what used to be referred to as Lower Side or the Lower East Side. It is now the East Village because we have arrived. At first they started to push out the Polish and the Ukrainians because they were the shop holders there. Then they started to push out basically the Puerto Ricans because they were the predominant ethnic group. But a lot of those gentrifiers that you think of when you use the word gentrify, and you're right, race is not so much person to person. It is more a systemic.
It's
event,
something right. It's something that's now it's left in the system, and I think that a lot of these have disproportionately racial effects. I think the effects of people.
Correct. Because when you go down 14th Street now, a lot of those stores who was initially thought of as the people who pushed out the original population are now being pushed out themselves for the exact same reason. So you go down 14th Street and they're all closing or closed because they can't afford the rent.
I think that's the perfect example. Gentrification happens in waves. You know, it's not just one event. I think when we think about gentrification, unfortunately, sometimes we think of it as the city coming in, knocking down someone's building, or a private developer coming in, knocking down someone's building, grandma gets pushed out, new condo goes up, and that this happens in a short amount of time. And then if it doesn't, we almost kind of question if it's even happening. And gentrification, as Nelson alludes to, takes like 30 years.
Right.
I mean, it is a long process. Now it changes depending on where you are. Williamsburg happened rapidly, around 10 years. That area, at least, that gentrified really strongly. Lower East Side took about 20 years up to around Avenue D, and even NYCHA's going to build luxury condos
I think
there.
that was because there was so much political resistance in the Lower East Side. There was a squatters movement, and they took over buildings, and they were
breaking windows. They were not having it. The Lower East Side, very clearly. I mean, we don't talk a lot. Some of the history we don't talk about. The Lower East Side was not about that at all, and they really made that very clear.
I know.
But anyway, so that's to say that East Harlem, now this is taking. People thought this was going to happen in the 80s. They thought it was maybe going to happen in the 90s and early 2000s, and we're still kind of in this middle ground that the subprime mortgage crisis kind of actually slowed down, oddly enough, in this neighborhood. But small business owners who are coming in, they can, or residents that are coming in, they can afford to pay more than grandma.
Right.
But eventually, someone's going to be able to pay more than them.
Correct. Eventually, someone's going to ask for $20,000 or $30,000 for a place that they cannot fill no matter what they do. It's also interesting that the rentals in Manhattan, in New York City, but specifically in Manhattan, was never truly affected by the collapse of the real estate market. Certainly, homes were, what your home was worth was affected, but the value of the rent structure. New York is a funny place. New York is the kind of place where they will wait for their price. I don't care if it takes 2 generations. They're just not going to sell until they get what they want.
You see that happening on Fifth Avenue right now, where they're supposed to, in theory, someday open up the Museum of African Art. That was kind of, I guess, the community compromise to building a huge luxury condo there. And That building's about was about 30% filled, and every real estate section in the city, be it the Times, be it the Journal, has been writing pieces just to try and sell those apartments. But the problem is they're future priced. The developers want to get what that'll be worth 5, 10 years from now. $800,000 for a studio that looks the opposite way of Central Park is not really what that's not really what the market dictates now. And so that's just to say, and they're still holding out. They still have a very vacant building. But they're waiting until they get their price.
Now, one of the things you alluded to was culture.
Sure.
And it's not a question of holding on to the past, but the past is indeed prologue. And to eradicate a culture that is so much a part of the identity of New York City in and of itself, I mean, this is the stuff of legend. When you talk about communities playing stickball and the kids playing in the fire hydrant, you're talking about
East Harlem is the birthplace of salsa.
Correct.
I mean, that's pretty important.
Culturally, very
in the
important,
world, kind of important.
And when you're talking to, the widow of Joe Cuba, I mean,
that was surprising as hell. I had no idea that was the widow of Joe Cuba until we were there, and I was like, oh.
Right. So you are actually talking about not simply eradicating people and community, and you're not simply talking about clinging to the past. You are talking about substantially removing the very essence and history of the legend of New York City itself.
I couldn't say any better myself. I was touring an 8th grade class around on Monday, not this Monday, last Monday, and they were a great class. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I feel bad that but they were awesome. They asked great questions. They were really engaged. They really enjoyed themselves. So I do tours of East Harlem, basically to teach about where the neighborhood's been, where it's now, and where it might be going. Just because you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And even if you're not from East Harlem, I think there's a lot to learn about how this neighborhood was treated by the government, public-private sector. Anyway, I just asked this 8th grade class something simple as we're on 110th Street. I was like, do you know Tito Puente? And I said this rhetorically because I wanted to show his walk-up, which is now abandoned on 110th. I couldn't even get to that point. It was used, it didn't make sense to really point it out, but they didn't know, not one kid knew who Tito Puente was.
That is awesome. That is unbelievable.
Not one.
Unbelievable.
And so, there's like a culture there, and it's not just so much about preserving, you have to preserve the people, yes, but the culture comes from the people. So a lot of times you see a lot of people trying to do it in reverse. They want to preserve the culture, but there's not enough being done to preserve the people. And you see kind of that in Central Harlem, where there is, everyone talks about the culture in Central Harlem, and we can see a picture of Langston Hughes or whatever inside the front of the cafe, but the owner isn't from that neighborhood, and most of the people who are eating there aren't from that neighborhood. So,
and one of the biggest downsides of losing your culture, which is the people themselves, we people of color, black and brown people, are people who are kitchen people, Mom's makes dinner and it brings the whole family. I'm a father. It's not easy for me to get everybody to my house on like a Thanksgiving, but the women can do that. The women cook and everybody is.
Well, I will say in my family, my dad does a lot of the cooking, but food is love. Food is love. There's no question about that.
I'm not even talking about so much who does the cooking, because I can probably outcook most of the females because, I hung out with my moms. And she was the best cook in the world. It's just something about the women that makes the family feel forced to come and to interact, and the whole culture and the spiritual thing.
Sure, absolutely. Strong women hold a family together, no question.
Correct. And when you break up that culture, you do damage to the children themselves, because if you do not understand where you come from, navigating a future is more difficult.
That's absolutely, and you see that in terms of people now trying to get active to stop things like gentrification, to get more equitable development, that you have a lot of elder people involved in that fight, because you know, they grew up during, you know, the earlier stages of it. They grew up in a totally different way. Off stage, we were talking about someone like Juan Gonzalez, who the way he researches stories, the way he looks at issues is something that just really, it's clearly just not from this experience. It's not from this present day. And so the issue is, yes, if you don't know your culture, if you don't know your history, if you don't know why what's happened around you has happened, why just the things are the way they are in your neighborhood, and you don't have that history of not only fighting back, but knowing, if you haven't fought back yourself, knowing that other people have before, and like the young lords, you know, were able to at times produce tangible results.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Right, if you don't have that history, if you don't get taught that type of stuff in school, then you kind of just take what's given to you as what it is. This is kind of how it's always been, and I don't really know of a way to change it. And just knowing that there are other people in your struggle, knowing that there are other people who've done something about it, whether they were very successful or not, knowing some people actually took action, that means something. It empowers you. I know that having that knowledge has empowered me. And if we don't have that knowledge to give to our kids and people from the community who didn't maybe grow up through those struggles, then they're not going to know how to navigate the future. Or it will be harder to navigate the future.
Right. It's also disappointing because a lot of those people who fought so hard to make sure that generations behind them have access to opportunities were brilliant, dynamic, beautiful people themselves. They really didn't need this kind of grief in their life, you know. Well, you know, I mean, it's one thing if, like, you're a total butt bucket, you know.
Total butt bucket.
You know, but when you talk about the Young Lords Party and guys like Juan Gonzalez, when you talk about guys like Felipe, there's a picture of Pedro Pietre at the corner, and I was surprised that very few people know who that is. And I'm like, oh, jive, it's Pedro. But they fought so hard and so long to make sure that we had so much opportunity. And we don't even know who they are. We think that, you know, America just one day woke up, Martin was dead, and they said, okay, we love y'all, and here's some money, you know. And
we're cool, right?
Right.
We're good.
We're good, right?
We're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just so... That's that's one of the more disheartening things. You know, someone was asking me the other day, you know, what do we do? How do we change that? How do we get that education out there? I was like, well, you have to advocate for it, certainly, but you have to learn it yourself and just teach it. I mean, that's all you can do. It's unfortunate to think that in this, you know, in this day and age, there's so many young people of color that don't actually know about these fights, that don't actually know that there were people who have already done the groundwork for them. You know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to do this from scratch. There's so many great activists out there, so many great community members who have fought to kind of allow this generation to, in some ways, not have to fight. Not that it's good now, but it's not where it was when the Young Lords were here. So you have the luxury of not having to, you know, confront the sanitation department and the cops just to get your street cleaned. They'll clean it once every 2 weeks. So it's not the same, you know, it's bad, but it's not on that level. And so you kind of live in an uneasy comfort that's almost, you kind of get trained to deal with it and kind of just accept it as life.
As is often the case, I get caught up in my own little world because I'm fascinated with the guests. And sometimes my producers are less than satisfied with some of the things I neglect. And one of the things that I have neglected is to ask you.
I'll say you mentioned our names. We're good.
Yeah.
Okay,
well, I didn't ask how you got so damn smart.
My dad would say that hasn't happened yet.
Oh, well, yeah, mine would too, but, you know, he'd say it with a few curse words. But how did you learn your technique, your filmmaking skills? Tell me about some of the sold-out venues where you had 500 people on a waiting list trying to get to see your film. Sure. Tell me about you, your film, the making of it, how you learned how to do this. You know, I asked you why, but I didn't ask you how you got to this, and, you know, so help us out.
Sure. Well, I never went to film school. I was lucky enough that in my last year at All Hallows High School in the South Bronx on 164 and Walton, they just happened to have a TV studio in the basement. They just happened to have a TV studio with like a couple cameras and a light that probably is just useless. It's not like the studio lights here. I mean, it was just like a floodlight. But I mean, you know, but it was cool, you know, because we just had that. We had iMovie, very basic tools.
Nice.
But I'd never held a camera before. I never actually, you know, in that capacity, and I'd never imagined doing anything with film. And so I got just some basic instruction on, you know, how to do a short, how to do a short doc, how to do a short narrative, and you know, from there it piqued my interest, and since then I've been, you know, working on getting better and trying to tell stories through film, because you know, originally I wanted to be a lawyer, and my parents are upset that I don't want to be one now, but I told them, look, you know, the only type of lawyer I'd be would be someone who's either keeping people out of jail who can't afford it, or putting bad guys in jail, and both of those have crazy caseloads and don't get paid or respected nearly enough. So I figured, you know,
the broke, hated variety of lawyer.
So I'm like, you know what, if I'm going to be broke, let me at least start doing something that I care about now. And I figured that this film was something that I could do now, that I, you know, had spent all this time studying and researching this and physically living it. And that this story is not just about this community, it's reflective of the change in New York, reflective of the change in the entire country, reflective in the change in many global cities throughout the world. So I figured at least this is something I could do now, tell the story of the residents here and what they're going through. And
were you a writer? And let me say this because I don't want to run out of time. We're going to be showing his film at the People's Film Festival at Maysles Theater. That's going to be June 1st, 2013. June 1st at Maysles is when you can see his film. The film is extraordinary. We've worked with Maysles before. Last year was a tremendous year for us. It was our inauguration, and it's only bigger and better with much better people coming in all the time. So that's June 1st, 2013 at Maysles Theater. As the weeks go on, we'll be giving you more and more input about that. You mentioned storytelling, and like you, I had never studied film or video or any of that at school. As a matter of fact, I had never touched a camera at all until I got to M&N. And I couldn't afford a Brownie camera. I couldn't afford a token to Brooklyn, much less a computer. So all of this stuff came as a result of having access to stuff that I didn't already, that I was locked out of the system of. But one thing I did learn, the biggest thing I learned was that it's all about telling stories. Did you do a lot of writing when you were a kid? Because you can learn technique, you can learn technology, you can learn, you know, and you can be the most technologically proficient, boring person in the world. But your ability to tell stories is exceptional. And when you bring that to the equation, that's what makes people flock to what you're doing. So were you always, did you do a lot of writing? Were you drawn to people who wrote? How did this happen?
I did. I mean, I did a lot of writing. I still do. But I think that I would attribute a lot of it to kind of how my parents raised me in terms of not so much how I created media, but more so how I consumed media. You know, they were, since I was a young child, always forcing me to read good writing and forcing me to read bad writing too. You know, so that I could understand why it was bad. And a lot of that was in terms of the media. So they would force me to read, you know, things like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal before Rupert Murdoch bought it, and then the Daily News and the Post, even though they're, you know, trash mags to an extent. Actually completely, but I mean, not, you know, and so, but they would ask me not just to understand why something had been written there, like not just like what it was, but why, not just why, but who wrote it, not just who, but who allowed them to write it, and then for what publication, and then why is that publication interested, and who, you know, kind of that, you know, saying who benefits, and they got me to kind of view things through that lens, and I think that that kind of inspired in me just to continue asking questions in my community and not just take, you know, what the governor might say is.
No offense, though. And we're going to open up the phone lines. If you want to, you can put the phone number down.
Oh, there are phone lines?
Yeah. Other people are going to be calling you and asking questions that
I
I'm
love
too stupid to
public
remember.
access TV. You never know what's going to happen. I'm so excited.
But in all fairness, cats who learn from like the Daily News and the New York Times, you know, I mean, they have the commercials, we're the best in the world, yada, yada, yada. But they're basically a dime a dozen. There is a flair to your filmmaking that reminds me of the Tito Puentes, the Perry Thomases, that cultural flair that adds so much, that salsa in your work, you know. Is that just a natural part of you, or how did that happen?
I think it's, you know, I'm born and raised here. And I think that if anything, my work can at times maybe seem a little out of the ordinary simply because there isn't a lot of it that's allowed to be promoted. The same way Juan Gonzalez or David Gonzalez, you know, their type of work, be for the Times or Daily News, might just seem like so out of the norm. It's because it's not actually. So, like, you know, the type of storytelling I do, to me, all I was doing, I wasn't doing anything special. I'm just trying to let the neighborhood tell their stories. And I'm trying to step back and allow that process to happen. But so often in media, we're told how we're supposed to feel about a certain group of people and told how we're supposed to feel about a certain issue. And there isn't a lot of dialogue, especially when we're talking about something like, you know, how we're going to, for instance, revitalize NYCHA, or how we're going to revitalize neighborhoods that have been systematically abandoned. There isn't really a diversity in dialogue in terms of what different solutions we can bring to the table. And so, you know, I think it's just, I just tried to do what I could to listen to the community and let their voices be heard. This way people can one day cite this. And cite this and say, okay, this is not what Andrew thought. This is not what, you know, this person from the neighborhood. No, this is an objective tale of what's actually happening in this community.
What's your sense of and we got a phone call. I just want to ask this question, and we're going to take the phone call. What's your sense of the mood of the community itself? Is it despair? Is it defiance? Doing this film, what was your sense of what the community was saying?
I felt like the community is dealing with this, but gentrification is a difficult issue because it's not like stop and frisk where, you know, you can get 50,000 people to come out on probably any given day in New York and get them out against stop and frisk. Why? Because that's something that's very physical. Cop comes up to you, pulls a gun out, takes the stuff from your pockets, charges you with marijuana in plain sight even though they took it out of your pockets. So that's something that can just, that happened, and you see it happen. Gentrification is something that happens over such a long-term process.
It's very subtle. And
a lot of times when
almost invisible.
Almost invisible, and by the time you realize it, it's too late, right? The only times you realize it are when you're walking out of the train and you see people who don't look like you, or stores that don't look like you.
But, and then it's over.
But I mean, at that point, that store, you know, had been someone's dream for years. That building had been a developer's dream for years. And the economic conditions forcing people from outside of the community to come in, those had been there for years. And so I think it's hard for there to be such a visceral connection if it's such a long-term process, but that's why the premiere screening was so amazing, because you can see people want to talk about this issue. There's 300 people there. Overflow room overflowed.
We expect to overflow Little Maisels. If the caller is still there, put the caller through. Caller, if you're there.
Gilbert,
hi.
Hi, how are you?
How you doing, caller? We hear you.
Good. I want to ask Andrew Padilla a question.
Go on.
Andrew, in moving towards your goals and your dream to communicate with film, tell stories that's going to empower people, I'm sure, I know you probably have been nudged by some negativity in the community, or maybe from family members or friends or honchos you hang out with, that you couldn't do it, that you were going up the wrong track and it's a waste of time. With that kind of negativity, how did you, or what techniques did you use to maintain your self-confidence so that you could continue to move forward and realize your dream? And number two, is on the community level. Do you see in the community on a whole, Elbarrio, because I come from Elbarrio too. I was raised for 26 years, 10 blocks from the studio right up there on 3rd Avenue in the projects. On a community level, do you see any apathy, as Nat mentioned, in the community, in people and families, about doing something to empower themselves individually and as a community? And if you do see any of that, what do you think would be the solution for people to nourish their self-esteem and nourish their self-confidence so they can move forward in lives and not just be, held in a grip by the so-called elite or people who are in control?
Excellent. Thank you. We're going to let him address that. You got the core of what he was asking?
Yeah, I'll try and do as quickly as possible. Thank you for the call, the question. It's a good one. In terms of negativity, I mean, you're always going to have negativity around you. Kanye does a song about it called Dream Killers. You can't really, it's a really good song actually. But I mean, no, I mean, there's tons of negativity that you'll see out there, be it from people close or far, but at the end of the day, I mean, if you look at the Residents video, there's just a whole bunch of like right-wing negativity on it. People saying some terrible things about, the people in the video and the community, but you can't let that affect you because, I used to really care what other people thought of me when I was a young child. I was very insecure. I mean, we all have our own insecurities now. I certainly do. But I mean, at the time, I was like, if someone made a joke about the shirt I was wearing, I couldn't fucking take it. And it was that's just where I was. And so there came a point in the 11th grade where I was exhausted. I was like, who the hell, like, I can't do this. Emotionally, I can't give a shit anymore. And in the 11th grade, I just stopped caring. And it was funny, I'd always been very unpopular throughout my life. And then I realized the minute I stopped caring, then all of a sudden people were nice. And I'm like, what? But that gave me perspective as well, because I said to myself, well, okay, I understand how fickle this can be on the one hand. And on the other hand, I understand I can't, I'm never going to find my happiness if I'm letting myself be dictated by others' negativity. I have to do, I have to do
sometimes
me.
The subtle negativity is the worst, as opposed to, that negativity that's right in your face. It's like whatever you were doing, and you're not actually saying anything to anybody, you're not bothering anybody, but there's always somebody who will tell you how they know someone somewhere who does it so much better than you ever could. They don't do it better than you ever could, but they know someone who,
Well, you know what? I mean, look, in life, there's always someone who can do it better than you can.
Correct.
There's always someone. So
Correct.
You can't get mad at that. The hope is that you can just listen and learn from that.
And they are indeed dream slayers. Just
Dream Slayers. Sounds like a good video game.
Yeah.
Might be.
The second question was about the community. We alluded to that before.
Sure.
But the community. How do you get the community to begin to address the problems that affect the community? Because, as you said, these are problems that are more stealth than in your face, like stop and frisk.
I mean, I think that it's something that everyone's experiencing, but I think that it's something that no one's necessarily talking about. That's the other thing with stop and frisk, because it's such an immediate reaction. We do have it in the dialogue. It is in the papers. It is very rare that you'll see like a full page on, I mean, I don't remember last time I saw something like gentrification in East Harlem. You might see an article that's talking about development in East Harlem and how property values are going up, and maybe in that real estate piece you might have a couple of dissenters. But in terms of a dialogue based on the change occurring in the community, very rarely. And so I think it's one that you don't even engage with people on that level. When I would tell people that what I was doing my film on, and I said gentrification, it's not that people don't know what it is. It's that it's just not polite dinner conversation to talk about. It's not. That's not cool. And so I think that the premiere that we had, having so many people and having such a diverse cross-section of the community and other communities there, and then having such a robust conversation with Charlie Rangel, of all people, getting up and yelling at the crowd, which was random and interesting. Yeah, because he was in the film. So he was there, and then people were getting up, and then he started talking around. He was like, how many of you vote? Like, just like getting into it with them. But I mean, like that sort of dialogue, be it with one's elected officials, be it with one's community members, on the issue of gentrification, in that big a forum, happens very rarely. So it starts with that. It starts with education and empowerment, and then there's a whole bunch of solution people that we bring to these panels, and we'll continue to do so after the film, so we can talk about not only how we feel, not only how we're being affected, but what it is that we can do to move forward. And so I think that it's a long-term process. It's not going to happen overnight. But it's got to start with the conversation. We can't be honest about, we can't fix the problem if we're not honest about what it is.
Right, right. Now, this question has more to do with your opinion than empirical evidence that you've researched or found in doing the film. But we do have unique obstacles, and no matter how well you do in the quote unquote white man's school system, there are still unique obstacles that you have to overcome. No matter how beautiful a movie star you are, no matter how talented you may be, if your skin is a little brown,
talking about gatekeepers?
Well, yeah, if your skin is a little brown, your roles are limited. If that's not to say that someone won't break through, but by and large, you know, the more off-white you become, the more difficult your road is. How do we encourage our children to not simply get an education, but to work harder than the competition, to exceed what is expected, and yet keep our dignity without being hateful or mean-spirited about it? Because, you know, a lot of times when you when you even broach the issue that there are systemic obstacles, you know, people get offended. Oh, what racism? There's no racism. It's you people. You don't know how to pull yourself by your bootstraps. You know.
Well, I think that that's well. In terms of that, I think that you know, pulling one up through their bootstraps. I think that one thing that people see when they go on the tours is, you know, East Harlem, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. These were neighborhoods that in the 70s were burning, and while they were burning, they were closing firehouses here that we are right now shooting in what was a firehouse that was abandoned and closed, and now is a very nice TV studio. But so it's harder to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You don't have bootstraps. That's a difficult thing. But I mean, in terms of, I mean, just specifically in terms of the media side of it, you know, in terms of, you know, gatekeepers and things like that. What I try to tell people is you have to be true to your own story. You can't try to tell someone else's, because no one can tell it better than them. And I think that when you talk about systemic issues of race, when we're talking about in media, it's not so much, I mean, I'm sure there are some people who, you know, for racial reasons, be like, I don't like that story because I don't like these people. Maybe that's there, but I think that a lot of it is also the same way that, you know, if we come on up, you know, you might bring people who are, it's a default to bring people who come from your experience. You know, default to bring people who are in your friends circle. You know, it takes a lot of wisdom to be someone who's going to be like, I'm intentionally going to bring people who are completely not from my experience in, and I'm not only going to take a risk on them, but take a risk that they might have an even better story to tell than I do. You know, that's a huge risk that not everyone takes. And so I think that that's one of the systemic problems that's there, that, you know, you're not going to see a lot of Latinos in media until you see a lot of Latino gatekeepers in media. You know, you're not going to see the same way you're not going to see a diversity in roles until the people who are actually up there or who are running their own media corporations that become so large. When those people in those executive positions are people with similar experiences, then they'll look for people who can reflect that. The same, you know.
Are we more afraid of risk than
the media is very afraid of risk.
Well, it seems like, well, I'm not sure of that, because when I look at cable specifically, and I look at cable channels, many of the white cable channels are willing to do anything it takes to become #1. And many of the cable channels that I see, we only have one that's actually black owned, but they seem more reluctant to take risk in you know, than they are in maintaining the fact that they don't offend anybody, can still sell Charmin, you know.
I mean, but I think that that's kind of in some ways comparing a gambler who goes all in and a gambler who, you know, maybe gambles 100,000. Like, it depends not so much on how much you're gambling, but how many chips you have. And so I think that, you know, maybe there might be some outlets, as you're saying, that maybe, you know, hold back a little bit more. Maybe that's because, you know, I think that's, I don't know, in terms of, as you said, the white media.
Is this a game for people who are afraid to go all in, though?
I don't know. I think that in terms of...
I mean, I turn on HBO, they got monsters coming out of people's, you know, women.
I mean, they have weird stuff there, but they're also, they're targeting that to a demographic that likes that. I don't think, for instance, HBO Girls, you know, some people might look at that show and say, that's a ridiculous show. It only talks about this small 1% of the millennial experience, a very, you know, monolithic 1% experience of millennials. But if that's your target demographic, that and people who aspire to one day move to New York and experience that life, well, then they're not taking a risk. So much as they have a target demographic, they'd be like, this demographic's going to watch, we're going to target it here. So I'm not sure, you know, I don't think that people are very, I mean, if you're looking at Hollywood, Hollywood's not risky. How many Fast and Furious have we seen? 6? We're on number 6. You know, we have movies like Three Musketeers, we have movies like G.I. Joe, just because people know the name. And, you know, you could easily replicate it. They're not telling stories from our neighborhoods because they think that they might not be universal. But they're going to things that they can save money on promoting or they can get buzz with easier. And I don't think those are decisions of risk. They figure we're in a bad economy and this is a proven model and we're going to hit it till it hurts. But eventually I think the well dries up. And I think that that's going to be where an opening will come up for people from this community and ones like it to create media that is truly different, to create media that is true to their stories. So what I said, don't try to tell their stories, tell your story, because no one can tell your story better. And when it's time to tell your story, none of them will be able to do it like you.
Do we even know our demographic anymore? We used to know who know our demographic. You know, when I look at, and I was handed this, I don't know if you could zoom in on this. It's Elbarrio Tours, Gentrification in East Harlem. An in-depth look at the phenomena of gentrification as seen through the changes in the largest Puerto Rican neighborhood in the 50 states. Wow, I didn't know all of that.
I actually have to put the People's Film Festival.
All right.
It's not there.
I think you just did, but
well, I just did. It's right there. The People's Film Festival.
Yeah, People's Film Festival, June 1st at Maisels. Like I said, when you look at the People's Film Festival, you know, they're not shying away from issues that relate to our demographic. You know, we're talking about Tucson Louverture, we're talking about gentrification in East Harlem. When I look at cable television that is supposedly designed for us, it doesn't seem so designed for us. It seems as if it's sort of us, but it's designed for anybody who wants something, you know, where are they now and that sort of thing. And that's what I mean by the risk. Certainly you're showing your film. Okay, we got another call and we're running out of time. But it takes it takes a certain amount of risk. You can't be completely averse to risk. When you talk about Tucson Louverture, you can't be adverse to risk. You know, whereas it's not so bad if Quentin Tarantino makes a film where, you know, you shoot up a whole lot of white folks. It's terrible if we do it. But let's take the phone call.
That is true. He got paid for that.
Paid big
He got paid
time.
for that. You might get put on a list.
I know. I might get disappeared. Caller, if you're there, we're going to take the phone call.
Yeah. Once again, Nat, excellent show. For my man, the gatekeeper brother and whatnot.
Yeah, Andrew Padilla.
Okay. You know, I was just curious. You know, like a lot of times when they show these so-called urban movies and whatnot, either it's about hip-hop, drugs, or something like that. I know when I was younger, some of the books that really made an impact on me were like Down These Mean Streets.
Right,
and,
Perry Thomas.
Man Child in the Promised Land.
Right.
You know, by Claude Brown.
Claude Brown,
you know,
right.
And, I mean, even especially Man Child in the Promised Land and whatnot. When I read that book, even though it was set back in like the 40s and whatnot, in the 50s, and I believe I read it like in the 70s or the 80s,
right.
I was like, I could draw parallels in my life from that book and whatnot.
Right.
And I'm like amazed that they haven't even tried to remake that.
Right.
You know, and I was thinking
well, you'd
about
have to have someone there who'd read it. You'd have to have an executive up there who'd actually read that book.
Wow.
And luckily, you've read it. But if the executive hasn't read it and just it's not part of their experience, it's not going to get done.
Yeah, that's true. But I was like looking at Red Tails and whatnot. I can't remember that director that brought that out. But you know, it was a pretty good movie and whatnot. But then I was like, wow, there's so much other literature by Latin and Black authors and whatnot that it just amazes me that, you know, they haven't even tapped into it yet. You know, I just want to throw that out there.
No, you're totally right. When you talk about down these mean streets, and even Claude Brown's book, Manchild, you're talking about period pieces where you got like fly women, fly clothing, you know, I mean, extraordinary story. Even if the executives haven't read the book, it seems strange to me that no one has come across this book and been able to put together a treatment that they could like sell to somebody. It seems like all the components of Blockbuster is there, you know.
And what I would say to people who want media like that, unfortunately, you've got to make it first,
right.
And you've got to make it. You know.
Oh, we got calls and we're almost out of time.
All right, great.
So let's take these calls. Caller, if you're there. All right, well, we're running out of time. I think we had to nix that because we only got like a minute left. So, again, I interrupted a dynamite question, but it doesn't matter because you're going to tell us about your film once again before we leave. And any other thoughts you have? We got like a minute for you to do this, so knock yourself out. It's yours for the next minute.
All I want to say is just thank you for the opportunity. It's been great being here. I'm really excited to be at the People's Film Festival. And if you want to find out more about Elbarrio Tours, just log on, just Google Elbarrio Tours. It'll be your first result. Go on to Twitter, Elbarrio Tours, and there you'll be able to find information on screenings and dialogues happening throughout the city. The hope is to take this film all throughout the city to neighborhoods that are experiencing this, or just any neighborhood in general that wants to have this conversation, because if you're not experiencing it yet, you might, or you did. And then the hope is to really take this throughout the country. I've had people in Toronto, in Georgia, on the West Coast, in Canada, you know, reach out and say, you know, we want to talk about this issue. It's happening here, and so there's a desire here. We just need to actually make it happen. And so if there are any people that want to organize screenings, even if it's in your basement, I'm down to do it. It's about the conversation. It's about moving towards action. So.
Excellent. Andrew, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're a very busy person, and we are honored to have an extraordinary artist like yourself to grace our stages.
Thank you.
And one thing we have established is that not only do we have a target demographic, but we have a market for the kind of stuff that you're doing. And it is incumbent upon all of us to take advantage of the fact that we have a market for extraordinary films from extraordinary filmmakers that represent us in a tremendous light. We got 10 seconds. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to 30 Frames a Second. We'll be back next week. Up until then, peace. We're out. Woo.